Hello and welcome to part 6 of our Rust for Beginners series. In this video, we will be looking at some common collections in Rust. So Rust standard library includes a number of useful data structures, which we call collections. Among those, we will be looking at vectors, strings, and HashMap. The first collection type we will look at is vec or vector. Vectors can only store values of same data type just like arrays. But unlike arrays, we can add more elements and remove the existing ones. Let's look at some built-in common functions of vectors. So there are a bunch of functionalities that are built in within these vectors, and I have divided them in following categories. So let's start with creating and initializing vectors. So we can initialize any vector using the new keyword, or we can use the vec macro. In vec macro, we have the option to pass elements while initializing the vector. We also have a with capacity function which creates a new empty vector with a specified capacity. Now if we want to add elements, then both this array must be mutable. And then we have two options. First we have push function which adds one value to the vector, and then we have the extend function which can be used to add multiple values. So within extend function, we can either pass a variable which is an iterable, or we can directly pass a vector or an array with multiple elements. If we want to access the first element within vector, then we can use the first function. Since a vector can be empty, this functions return an option. Just like first, we also have a last function. Now if we want to access any other element, we can either directly access it or use a get function. If we access it directly and the element does not exist, then Rust will throw a panic. Whereas if we use a get function, then we can do the proper error handling. Removing elements is pretty straightforward. We have remove function in which we pass the index of the element that we want to remove. Then we have pop function which removes the last element from the vector. And finally we have the clear function which clears out the entire vector. So first up we have the len function which returns the number of elements present in the vector. We also have capacity related functions like capacity which returns the number of elements that the vector can hold without reallocating, reserve which reserves capacity for more elements, shrink to fit which shrinks the capacity to fit the current number of elements. But probably as a beginner you won't be using any of the functions related to capacity. Now if you want to iterate over the elements of the vector, we can use for loop and iter function for that. And if you also want to modify the values, then you can use iter mute. We also have into iter. The only difference between iter and into iter is that in into iter we get the ownership of the values, whereas in iter we only get the reference. We have a sort function that performs an in-place sorting. We have reverse function to reverse the vector, and we have dedup which removes consecutive identical elements. We also have a function for binary search, and after sorting the array, we can perform binary search using an inbuilt function. Now if we want to filter out some elements that do not fit a criteria, then we can use retain function. In retain function we pass a predicate. If it is true, then the element is kept within the vector, otherwise it is moved. We also have drain function in which we pass a range and the elements with indices corresponding to that range are removed. There may be some functions that work with one type of vector but do not with other. For example, join function, which we can use on string or str type vectors, and this function concatenates all the elements into a single string. There are also a lot of variation of the functions that I have mentioned, and also there are a lot more functions, but these should be enough to carry out most of the operations. So, Rust only has one string type in core language, which is the string slice or str, but we usually see it in the form of and str. The string type that we generally use is provided within the Rust standard library and not the core language. String type is what allows us to make a growable, mutable, owned UTF-8 encoded string type. Also, the string collection is just a wrapper over a vector U8. And this video is more about this type of string, as it is a type of collection, whereas a string slice is not. Now, since the strings are UTF-8 encoded, we can use characters from a bunch of different languages. And there are three relevant ways to look at strings from Rust perspective: as bytes, as scalar values, and as grapheme clusters. So if we look at a Hindi word Namaste, which is written in Devanagari script, it looks like this. Rust does not allow us to index into a string. We can get a range, but we cannot index to get a character. And that's because indexing operations are expected to always take a constant time. But it isn't possible to guarantee that performance with a string. If we again look at the Namaste example, as scalar values, there are 6 elements. But as graphene cluster, which is what a person would expect, there are only 4 letters. And that is because the fourth and the last element is a diacritics, which do not make sense on their own, but rather change the pronunciation of letters on which they are attached to. What this means is that if we want to get a single character, let's say the third element from the graphene cluster, Rust won't be able to directly give it to you. It would have to walk through the contents of the string from the beginning to determine how many valid characters there are. Now let's look at some functions and operations that we can carry out over strings. To create a string, we can use new function, which creates an empty string. If you want to create from string slice, then we can do string from and then pass the string slice. We will be modifying these strings, so let's make them mutable. To append to the strings, we can use push function, which adds one character at the end of the string. We can use push str to add a string at the end of our current string. And we can also just add 2 strings, but while adding, we have to make sure that the first string is owned and the second string is borrowed. We also have format macro, which allows us to place strings or even other data types within other string. Now, if we want to break down the string to its characters, we can use the chars function. And if we want to break it down into bytes, then we can use bytes function. We also have a split function, which breaks it down based on a delimiter. Now, we can't get a specific element, but we can get a range. So we can use the get function and pass a range of index, and then we get that range of characters from the string. Since indexing is not allowed, one of the way to get a specific character is the chars function. So here I can't get a single character, but I can do a.chars and then use the nth function and pass the index in that. This way I do get a single character. So if we want to check whether a substring exists in the string or not, then we can use the contains function, which returns a boolean value. We have find, which returns the index, otherwise panics. And if we want to replace a substring, then we can use the replace function. Now if I move the replace function over the find function, then we'll get an error, as the replace will replace the substring that find is looking for. So make sure either the value does exist when using find, or don't use the unwrap, use a proper error handling method. We also have functions like trim, which removes the empty space from the beginning and the end. Text transformation is pretty straightforward. We have functions like to uppercase or to lowercase, which returns a string into upper or lowercase. Finally, we have the clear function to remove every character from the string and make it an empty string. And then we have truncate, which resizes the string to the length which is provided within the truncate function. So in this example, only 3 starting index will be kept, others will be removed. The last of our common collection is the hash map, which stores a key value pair and is one of the most widely used data structure. It's also from the standard library of Rust and has a constant time to look up any element based on the key. To create a hash map, we can use the new function, but we do need to give the proper type. So I'm giving string type for keys and i32, integer 32 for the values. Let's make it mutable because we will be adding elements. To insert into hash map, we can use insert function. So we give a key and value within the insert function and the element is inserted. We can use entry with or insert. So we'll do map.entry and pass the key. If it exists, then nothing happens, but if not, then or insert function will insert the value passed into it. To access elements, we can use get function, in which we just do map.get and pass the key. This returns an option, so we do need to unwrap it. If we want to change the value stored within the key, then we can use get mute. And then we can update the value as well. We also have other functions like contains key that returns a boolean value based on whether that value for that key exists or not. And we also have get key value, which retrieves a reference to both key and value as a tuple. To remove an element, we just use the remove function and pass the key within it. This remove function also returns the value that it is removing, so we do get an option as a result. And we also have the retain function, which takes a predicate, and based on the condition, the value is either kept or removed. Now if you want to iterate over the map, then one of the ways is to use the keys function, which gives you all the keys, which we can use to get the values. We also have the values functions, which gets all the values. And if you want to update those values, then you can use the values mute function. Now, if you want both key value pairs, then you can use iter. And if you want key value pairs and also the option to update the value, then you can use iter mute. HashMap also has retain function just like vectors. So we can pass a predicate, and if the value satisfies that predicate, it will be kept within the HashMap, otherwise it will be removed. And finally, we have the clear function to clear the entire HashMap and remove all key value pairs. So these were some common collections that you will be needing as a beginner. Hope this was helpful. If you enjoyed this video, please give a thumbs up, do consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next one.